Taiwanese counterpart, we have in the past 30 years the emergence of many native Taiwanese or indigenous Taiwanese writers, artists. So I wonder whether you have some kind of Australian Indigenous Writers Association and a group of writers, and what kind of production you have may make a point to the mainstream to white Australian society. I don't know whether in this area, in terms of literature, arts, what kind of they have. Thank you.
There are a number of, it's a very good question, thank you. There are a number of Indigenous media, Indigenous organisations which group together Indigenous artists, whether they're actors, writers, directors. Some of them are informal, but there are some formal organisations where those people gather together to talk about content. Some of the Indigenous producers, Indigenous directors actually prefer to not refer to themselves as Indigenous. They see themselves as artists. Just because I'm Indigenous doesn't mean that I'm not an artist. So some have actually preferred, they don't want to be known as Indigenous because they want to be seen as artists and able to hold up their heads in any forum. But on the question of producing content, I think one of the conclusions that I've come to over looking at Indigenous media in Australia and in Canada in particular for many years now is that the content may not necessarily be the most important aspect of an Indigenous media process. It's the process of producing it which is perhaps more important than the content that is produced, because the process enables those communities and those people to engage with each other to produce something as a collective which says something about their community, about themselves. So I think the process of production, I think, is much more important in many ways than the content. The content is important, of course, because you see, images of people and role models and so on, but it's the process that produces that, which I think is far more complex and far more important. And that's where the Indigenous public sphere, I think, idea can really has its important impact.
Thank you, Professor Michael Meadows, for the wonderful speech. And so please give the biggest applause to Professor Meadows. 好，那抱歉，因为我们的时间就是非常有限，那没有办法再用中文再为大家解释。我相信我们的听众其实都已经知道说 Michael Meadows 他刚刚的意思了。那我们刚刚也注意到我们的立法委员孔文吉先生也到场了，请孔先生来跟我们现场的观众也打个招呼。非常谢谢您OK。
我特别为了 Michael Meadows 来，
是
送给我他的书，我一本书啊，我拥有他的三本书啊，是。为了他我特别来。
Our Congressman Kong Wen-ji, yeah, he is the only one PhD of mass communications of indigenous people in Taiwan. So, yeah, the key person for our indigenous media policy.
Thank
好，谢谢孔文吉委员到场那我相信我们今天其实剩下还有很多的时间，我们可以继续的不管是我们澳洲纽西兰的其他原住民媒体的经验，跟我们台湾的经验包括我们的不管是政策制定者我们的媒体的这个文化事业机关跟我们在座的各位关心原住民媒体的朋友我相信我们今天可以有一场非常好的交流，非常的感谢。好，那我们接下来呢请让我们接下来要欢迎的是Professor Volker Hanisch。Professor Volker Hanisch, he is a senior lecturer and program leader in journalism, University of the Sunshine Coast from Australia. He is a former journalist who has worked as a reporter and editor for German language and Australian newspapers, and he has worked in media industry for 10 years. And currently, his main research interests include comparative journalism practice, news representation of days and dying, indigenous journalism, as well as lifestyle journalism, in particular travel journalism. Professor Hanisch has published several books and also almost 30 academic articles in high-quality national and international journals. So today he will give us the speech regarding indigenous journalism, especially the case of Maori television in New Zealand. So let's welcome Professor Volker Hanisch.
It's an honour and a privilege to talk to you today, and I'd firstly like to thank Professor Hong for the generous invitation to speak to you all, and just say how an amazing and inspiring time I think we've already had in a short few days in this beautiful country. I'd like to thank the University and the Graduate Institute of Journalism, as well as the Indigenous Communication and Culture Research Centre. I think it would be remiss of me to start also without acknowledging the Indigenous Peoples Culture Foundation, as well as the Indigenous peoples of this country and the strength and their resilience over centuries. And because I'm talking about Maori journalism today, I should also say a couple of words in Maori as a welcome and thank you, which is tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. This is basically I will talk about today on a study that I conducted a couple of years ago on Indigenous journalism, because my primary interest is journalism studies, and so it's a sort of a sub-field perhaps of the broader media studies, simply because I've always been fascinated at the way that Indigenous peoples conduct journalism and the importance that plays for the public sphere. I hope to also perhaps draw some interesting aspects that might be reminiscent to some of you about the situation in Taiwan and maybe in other countries as well. I think to begin with, we can see a renaissance of Indigenous media around the world over the past couple of decades, perhaps more remarkable in some countries than in others. A significant factor in these developments have been the 1970s and the 1980s movements in a lot of countries by Indigenous peoples for recognition that also resulted in movements at the United Nations and generally also along with advancements in information and communication technologies that have allowed Indigenous peoples to develop their own media, which have often happened for activist purposes. Throughout this process, journalism has emerged as an important practice in enabling Indigenous peoples to counter the narratives around Indigenous societies which mainstream news media have shaped in the past, and quite regularly in negative ways. We all know about the negative coverage of mainstream media that Indigenous peoples have received. As such, Indigenous journalism not only offers counter-narratives, but it also has the potential to empower Indigenous communities, contribute to language revival, a very important function, and the maintenance of cultural traditions. At the same time, though, something that I want to argue is that it can also fulfill journalistic ideas and ideals of being a watchdog of those in power. This development is very much global, and there are increasing signs of collaboration among Indigenous media organisations. For example, the establishment of the World Indigenous Television Broadcasters Network, which I guess some of you might be familiar with, and TOTV is obviously a partner there. The network brings together broadcasters from Canada, the United States, Hawaii, the Pacific Islands, New Zealand, Australia, Taiwan, South Africa, the British Isles and Scandinavia. And in regard to journalism, one perhaps interesting development has been the production of Indigenous Insight, which I mentioned my screen here on TITV as well. It's a half-hour current affairs program that screens content from member organisations. This increasing collaboration has led Valerie Alia, a very prolific researcher on Indigenous media, to speak of a new media nation. And she says that it's no real nation in the political sense. It exists outside the control of any particular nation state and enables its creators and users to network and engage in transcultural and transnational lobbying and access information that might otherwise be inaccessible within state borders. So we are seeing arguably a transcultural development where Indigenous peoples around the world are trying to collaborate and help each other. While Indigenous media more broadly and their role in countering stereotypes have received some attention in the literature, there have been really only a very few studies that examine specifically the ways in which Indigenous journalism operates. That is somewhat surprising given that Indigenous news media have existed for quite some time, and we could argue that there are precursors even before colonisations of traditional news media systems, of course. And I will look at this specifically here in the case of Maori journalism as it has been practiced in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so every time I will speak of Aotearoa, I will be referring to New Zealand, but I think it's more appropriate to use the Maori term. So I will give you a little bit of an overview of its historical practices, historical development and the current practices as well. And perhaps argue that there might be similar trends elsewhere around the world. Just to set the scene, and very briefly only the situation of Indigenous peoples in Aotearoa, I guess most of you would be familiar with the eventual homeland, arguably, of Māori might actually be right here in Taiwan. There are genetic and linguistic links, of course, Austronesian language groups, that people migrated over centuries down to the Pacific Islands and then eventually came to New Zealand, Aotearoa, in the 13th century from East Polynesia. Many different iwi or tribes developed in Aotearoa, which all have their own dialects and slightly differing customs. So while many perhaps see them nowadays as a very united group, there are actually quite important differences still between the different tribal groups. Europeans only became aware of the country's existence in 1642 when the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman arrived. At that time, it's believed that there were 100,000 Maori before contact. The early interactions regarded whaling and seal trades, and in the early 19th century, Christian missionaries arrived. Britain became more and more interested, and on February the 6th, 1840, a very important document for the future of the country was signed through the Treaty of Waitangi, signed between the English Crown and Maori chiefs, regarded as the nation's founding document, but actually very controversial because of slight differences in the Maori translation from the English, and there have been numerous fights over the interpretation of this document in the decades and a couple of centuries to come. Maori gave up powers of government to Britain and in return became British subjects. They were guaranteed possession of their lands and other taonga or treasures. And therefore British sovereignty over the country began. The relations between the two groups deteriorated over time, with the British breaching the principles of the treaty on numerous occasions, in particular in regard to land rights. Land wars followed, and over time Maori rights were quashed, leading to an enormous loss also of the Indigenous language, because children weren't allowed to speak their language in the school grounds anymore, and there was a huge decrease of native speakers for a long time, only until the 1970s, when a Renaissance movement that was fighting for improved political rights really sort of tried to put this issue to the forefront, also leading in 1975 to the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal, which adjudicates on claims over breaches of the treaty. There have been a number of reparations paid and settlements reached between the Crown and Māori Iwi. One of the perhaps really important issues that I will come back to as well has been a recognition of the language as a treasure, and that has really driven a lot of the development in terms of broadcasting and funding, government funding for broadcasting. Today there are just over 600,000 Māori, approximately 15% of New Zealand's population of 4.4 million. So it's actually a lot higher, of course, than in Taiwan or in Australia. But only around 25,000 of those can speak the Māori language, which is, however, an official language of Aotearoa New Zealand.